You're listening to Peel Talks Housing, the Region Appeals podcast delving deep into complex issues around affordable housing and homelessness and efforts to help residents get and keep housing. Episodes will feature residents with lived experience, Region Appeals staff, our partners, academics, policymakers, and other leading voices in the affordable housing sector. The opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individuals expressing them and may not reflect the opinions of the Region of Peel or the direction provided by the Region Appeals Council. Hey everybody, welcome to Peel Talks Housing. My name is Axel Villamil and I'm your host today. The topic for discussion is youth homelessness. We are joined today in the studio by two amazing guests. We have Becky Neild and Danny Mills. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
No worries. Becky, can you please tell everybody here what exactly that you do in your position?
So I currently work at an organization called Associated Youth Services of Peel. AYSP is kind of our commonly known acronym. And I am a clinical program supervisor there. I supervise a few programs, particularly for youth at risk across the Peel community. So we're an outreach-based program.
Amazing. Danny.
All right, I'm Danny Mills. I'm the Senior Manager of Outreach Services and Program Development with Our Place Peel, youth homelessness serving organization. I'm also one of the managers operating the Anti-Human Trafficking Service Provider Hub and Courage in Peel.
Thank you so much. Sounds like we have a very experienced set of people here. I mean, this topic is something that I feel like a lot of people don't really understand exists because of what you normatively see out on the streets, but it's also, it's a real issue. And there's actually people, I've met where I had no idea. And they're among us every day and they're just people. Right. And I feel like one of my questions personally before, I kick off deeper is how do we kind of attack that stigma between the two of, what is deemed as what homeless looks like?
Yeah, definitely. Having come from Toronto previously, where you see more of the homelessness on the street, we definitely have more hidden homelessness within Peel. However, the numbers remain the same. It still remains extremely high for youth experiencing homelessness. They tend to couch surf, reside with friends, these sort of things. So it remains a bit hidden, but due to a lot of stigma that comes with it. So it's a lot of, accessing the right services, but trying to keep it low key at the same time. So it's a reason why a lot of individuals in Peel don't think it's as big of an issue as it is.
I totally agree with you, Danny. And I also think people don't want to believe that there are youth that don't have a safe place to sleep in. So I feel like that's part of, it feeds the stigma. So there are certainly people out there that have judgments around someone who might not have a safe and stable home. And particularly for a lot of our adults in our communities across sectors, I think the reality is to actually sit in the discomfort of recognizing that there are young people that don't have safe and stable housing is a really difficult thing to grapple with. So I think that's another element.
You got it on the head of the nail there, which is the sitting with discomfort is tough. And I feel like a lot of the conversations that we talk here on this podcast are things like that. And that's why we're having the conversation, which is really great. So I guess, we're talking about the stigmas. There's a lot of things about being low key, but I think I would love to dial it back and actually figure out what youth homelessness is defined as. Like, is it considered when are they considered homeless? Because again, I think it's this discomfort that a lot of people don't really understand what that, I guess, event or that definition would actually be.
Yeah, I think for me, I look at kind of the definition of youth homelessness. I also really like to think about it as like being housing insecure, because I think that I look at it really from a preventative measure in the fact that a young person could seemingly be going to and from their home every day and could be really struggling with staying in that home. And to me, that's someone who is very at risk of being homeless. And, typically we think about it from the age of 16 because that's when they are able to access shelters. However, really what we know of, if it starts a lot younger. So I think home is beyond just a bed and the four walls. I think it's that breakdown in the relationship of their caregiver or maybe their biological family, and just not feeling safe and stable.
Yeah, I agree. The key word there at the end that Becky just mentioned, safe. I think it really comes down to the individual youth's ability to define what safe is, and having, you know, supports and services to understand and hear what it is they're saying. So when safety does not feel number one within those four walls, however it may look, that really begins the breakdown and leads to that precarious housing. You know, when we talk about safe, stable, consistent, these sort of things, that's really the requirements from, I think we all look at it from a preventative piece, hoping that we can get ahead of it, but also recognizing and hearing the stories over the years of the youth that we've served and how they came to be homeless. These were key factors and warning signs that they had early on.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like that's what we need to hear more from the general public, which is like, what are those stories? Because I feel like there's this common stereotype that the public would put out is like, oh, they're drug addicts, they're runaways, they're like clearly bad kids, so they don't care, blah, blah, blah. How do we dispel that, especially through, maybe is it through campaigns and things we can do for the region? Is it through your organizations? Like, how would we do that?
I'm super passionate about this as working for a youth homelessness organization and having worked with youth my entire career. I think we all know in society as a whole, it's extremely dangerous to, paint a picture or a stigma and stereotypes of what one might be going through and so forth. I think, everything from media campaigns to movies and so forth have really played into a stigma of what homelessness looks like in general. And we really need to reframe that lens because it does mean different things for different people. There's always the picture of the youth sitting on the street with a sign like against a brick wall, like these typical.
I hate those.
Yeah, but it's really, it looks so different for each youth. And I think being able to, share some of these stories and empower the outcomes of which, yes, one may have experienced homelessness, but let's look at the full picture, not just a snapshot of potentially a really low time. I think that we need to, approach it with compassion and understanding and patience when it comes to youth, because we're talking about a very different, unique population going through the most difficult development time of their life, and being able to give them more understanding and patience and the respect that they don't want this either. And it's not the ultimate outcome. And we want to see them as, successfully contributing to their life story and outcome and, not aging into adult homelessness and so forth. So I think empowering through success stories that I know both our organizations have significantly more of than, some of the way that it's painted. And I think that that's really the trajectory of where things are going, is a better understanding of what homelessness looks like in Peel, particularly.
I totally agree, Danny. And I always, you see those pictures or you see the representation in movies. And, I've had the privilege of working with youth. I started in the field as an outreach case manager and counselor working with the RAIN program. And working with Our Place Peel and all the great resources across, our communities. And I'll tell you one thing I quickly learned is there are definitely overrepresentations, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But I think the other piece is that no one youth story is the same. I have seen youth that have come from, very from the outside, a nuclear family, and there have been lots of issues that they have had to face. So that stigma or that the judgment of seeing a youth, like with a backpack sitting against a wall, looking down, doesn't do it justice, because there's so many other youth and there's so many other unique stories. But I fully agree. There's a lot of successes too, and that's where I like to lean into, on those tough days.
Yeah, absolutely, and then that's it. We need to see more. Everybody likes to look at the negatives. It's more interesting, or they think that's what's going to catch people's eye. But in reality, I think what's going to make us sleep at night is it's those successes and seeing that we're improving a community.
I think the other thing too, it just came to me. I mean, to challenge the notion of the fact that youth that are homeless or underhoused or accessing shelter supports, are just wanting to party or do drugs or what have you is, I would challenge that by saying, do you even know what the expectation is for a young person that has to stay in a shelter? They must, there is an expectation. They have to go to school. They have curfews. It's not just an open door, here's a bed. So there is an expectation as well. And that's the other thing that I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand.
Just to echo that, this is a topic we could probably talk about for days, right? It's the there are key strengths with a lot of the youth we see day in and day out that I wish, so many people could model the resiliency that our youth have and their ability to still fight through knowing these stigmas are on them and still recognize and push through every day and hold down a job and attend school because they're thrust into adulthood with some really unrealistic expectations put on them while going through a significant trauma. We have to remember, experiencing homelessness is a trauma. And, the ability to fight through that and still get up every morning, because all of these things can lead to the depressions, the anxieties, all of these impacts on their mental health. Their resiliency day in and day out is absolutely phenomenal. And I think it's, taking a look at what it takes to still get out of bed each day and take a step in the right direction while experiencing homelessness is really something to help advocate for and encourage and, let the community or have the community behind them saying, we're here for you. How can we help?
The trauma lens and that brain development too, right? They're at those key, I always say this too, adolescence, there's 2 times in our life where our brain is rapidly developing. One is in infancy and one is in adolescence. And so in infancy, what happens? You hope, you have hopefully a very safe and supportive environment where you can sleep, right? You are given food, you are given the basic necessities of life. The next time our brain is rapidly developing like that is through adolescence. And so pair that with trauma, and, the youth are doing the best that they can to just try to make it through each day.
Of course, I can only imagine guys, it's hard. Life is hard enough with a home. I couldn't even imagine without a home, and the resiliency that the youth have to keep pushing is astronomical. So I would love to talk about, they're going to push through things. What are those barriers that they would have to push through? You touched up, they're over a bunch, which was your mental health. I'm sure getting a job must be tricky, especially if you don't have the resources to even get to that place, things like that. So what are those barriers that we can talk about?
The discrimination and the stigma is, a huge one that we could probably spend the rest of this podcast talking about. So, discrimination would be the first one, right? Again, whether that's in accessing employment, whether that's in navigating the systems, things like that. But there's a huge issue with discrimination for young people. There's obviously the overrepresentation of 2S LGBTQ plus youth. Racialized youth, Indigenous youth, and then I can't not mention too intergenerational trauma and the fact that a lot of the young people are coming from homes that in itself have not been safe and secure. And perhaps their parents as well, right, are struggling and have perhaps come from the child welfare system. That's another piece. So there are definitely a lot of barriers. Again, we could probably go on. I'll hand it over to Danny because I'm sure.
I think you just ran down my whole list in my head. It's so true. And I think each one of those come with their own barrier within a barrier. So you look at discrimination and automatically you have age against you. Just sheer age trying to rent a unit, the adult presenting at the same time, more than likely it's going to go to them. Then you add the complex level of depending on which gender or orientation, then you add a racialized youth into the mix and trying to find suitable and sustainable housing. It's just all these layers and the intersectionality of where all of these items. So where someone might think an youth experiencing homelessness may have, 1 or 2 barriers. It's not as, it's way more complex than that because it starts to add up in regards to if it's just looking for housing, you need a fixed address, whether it's to get the employment in order to get the experience, to have the credit to be able to rent, all of these aspects, right? So they have so many things working against them from a system and systems, and then there's overrepresentation of youth in corrections. And I believe you mentioned aging out of the child welfare system and so forth, right? It's just, it's there's a lot of pathways in, and that's the piece where from a prevention side, work is still to be done. But, looking at the barriers, it's so unfortunate because it's really endless with youth. They don't have the opportunity to just kind of, even if it's just home and be able to start addressing mental health, that's difficult enough on a day to day. But you add all these traumas and complex additions, and it just becomes overwhelming.
As you were mentioning some of that, I just kept thinking too, I mean, the sheer barrier of the financial side of housing is massive too, because if a young person is, first off, if they are even approved for Ontario Works, which that in itself requires quite a few steps from someone, I think they're living in and around like $700 a month. And a portion of that's for everything, so that's for rent, that's for food, clothing, transportation, right? These are young people that also have to get to and from school or work or what have you. So, trying to wrap my head around living off of $700 a month and being 17 years old it's
a lot. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot for them, not even people over 17 can even fathom, because there's some people that even had those experiences, right? So it's it's quite astounding to hear all that. And I would love to go deeper. You all spoke about how just being homeless is there's discrimination because of the stigma behind it. So let's talk about racism affect homeless youth. What are some of the challenges that youth face who are from racialized communities?
Systemic and historical trauma is the first thing that comes to mind there. It's, this is something that has been happening long before my time and continues to happen on a daily basis. So I think we first should acknowledge and understand that, root our services and our supports and anti-oppressive practices and understanding, the privileges that we take and have. I think, they face, like Danny said earlier, overrepresentation in the justice system, increased risk of violence, increased risk of gang involvement, and other things like that. So really just to go back to kind of anchoring it on the prevention, but understanding the impact of the history.
Becky mentioned it before about the intergenerational traumas, and that's definitely somewhere that, even from our organizations and taking seeing the broader systems and understanding and having that, the proper trainings involved in all of these aspects to our organizations, but being able to see it day in and day out. And how do we begin to change that narrative and see where we can make our impacts? I mean, we're talking about systemic poverty. We're talking about, society's impact on, we were just having this conversation the other day, society's impact on Black families, which then the impact on the youth. And then you add in the intergenerational trauma. And just as a whole, like, we know that systems have worked against, and how do we begin to change that narrative where they are working for them and with them to change that narrative and start to see less and less representation from systems that have just really become a conveyor belt right into the system in different ways, right?
Absolutely. I feel like there's so many different communities. Like, it's just unpacking everything about youth homelessness right now, especially with the two best that can help me chat about it. We talked a lot about unpacking youth homelessness. We talked about racism, we talked about all the stigma behind it. And then also we talked about the LGBTQ2 plus community. There's a stat here from Observatory on Homelessness and there's a stat based on the book published by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and Away Home Canada. About 40% of youth experience homelessness identify as LGBTQ2 plus. So those, they face a unique set of challenges. And I'm wondering, what type do you see in the stories that you hear? What are those challenges?
So I think for myself in particular, I'm very passionate about the 2S LGBTQ plus community. I actually have had the privilege previously of supervising a program at AYSP specific for youth in our community. And family breakdown is the first thing that comes to mind. Lacking allyship, lacking the ability to feel safe and coming out at home. I also think the youth that are impacted by this are younger and younger. And so just feeling, again, that you can, we know this across all youth. They are exploring their sexual identity. They are exploring their gender orientation. That's the time to do it, right? And it's just, they face so many barriers. And then the other piece is in accessing services or accessing shelter support. If they're gender fluid or, not passing, things like that, it becomes very tough for them. Talk about the stigmas and the discrimination, and then the at risk of violence, trafficking, the list goes on. So I think just struggling with that. I know in Peel, there's a particular shelter specifically for 2S LGBTQ plus youth, in Toronto. And I just think that, making sure that we have people with lived experience to really support those youth that are at risk of homelessness or in the shelter system is really important.
Yeah. To add to that, this is where a lens of the various intersectionalities come into play, because we talk about overrepresentation, and then we talk about, a young Black identifying youth who identifies within the community of LGBT, right? And it's really difficult because of the additional barriers that are then faced. And we see this day in and day out operating youth shelters, and the youth accessing, like, the statistics are dead on in terms of who we see and who is represented. And it puts them at extreme risk coming into environments where there's additional, there's already in society increased risk for violence. This impacts their mental health. There's additional stigmas to the community as a whole. But it really comes back to, like, the family breakdown and the rejection, or how they may have come to experience homelessness. And that is a significant path we see, whether they were involved in the child welfare system from foster care to group homes, but then, taking a look at accessing shelter, we're talking about potentially on any given day, 40% of that population identifying as, and knowing that when rejection happens, that impedes your ability to trust another adult in your life, right? So Becky was saying, like, we need to have strong supports in place within our organizations, as this is what we do day in and day out, so that there's representation and people understand, and it can be an open, safe conversation, a safe place to stay. And that goes so much deeper than the typical, like, stickers on the walls and saying you're safe, right? Like, you have to walk the walk and talk the talk in terms of showing, these communities and these youth, regardless of their background, that you understand and you're there to listen and support. I think too, within youth, as Becky was mentioning, like, this is an exploration, like, age where they're just trying to figure out, like, who they are. We all went through it. I'm not talking about particularly LGBT, but just in general, our brains developing. We're trying to, what do I like? Music changes from day to day. All the friends change week to week, all of this, right? And then you add in these added complications of, society's impact of stigma and the complication of how that looks. And then it adds the additional difficulty to figure out and be able to explore and identify who you are within the community as well. So just knowing that there's safe places that youth can go. And I think that, when we see the percentage of those accessing, I think it shows that there are safe places for them to access. But really, I agree with Becky, like, dedicated supports and recognizing and having representation across the board of who can support these youth is super important to make them feel safe and be able to take that deep breath and be able to think for a moment, not worry about where they're going to have to stay for the night type thing.
Absolutely. I mean, you already both touched on my next question, because I wanted to shift gears here, because I think what I've learned from you two, if anything right now, is success, right? Let's talk about the successes, which is talk about how do we actually fix youth homelessness, especially in Peel. So in Peel, the stat here is we currently have 2 youth shelters for youth ages 16 to 24. So we have one youth transitional housing site. You did talk about supports. What would you say is missing for youth in Peel?
I think Peel has done a quite a good job in terms of trying to be as preventative as possible. I think in terms of the supports, though, one thing that comes to mind, particularly for youth that are homeless or have insecure housing, is really not solely depending on our child welfare system to, do the full protection and all of that, under the age of 16. So I work at a community-based organization, and we certainly have flexibility in our services and our mandates, and I'm so appreciative of that. And I would love to see just really true collaboration across sectors. So healthcare, police, justice system, child welfare, and there are lots of tables that, Danny and I have been a part of through the years, and there's lots of really good work in theory happening. And I want to see it in practice, because I think I have lots of success stories. And I was talking about it with my team the other day. A lot of these success stories, to me, when I take away all the wonderful clinical work and all of the, emergency supports, the one common theme to me is like strong collaboration. So putting that youth at the center and everybody else working around, communicating effectively, understanding how we can, flex some mandates, right? To kind of think outside of the box for these young people. So I don't know if that answers the question so much in terms of like specific supports. Maybe Danny will be more articulate with this than me, but I think really just like strong collaboration and fully utilizing existing services, I think are two big things that stand out.
So 2 words that came to mind were collaboration and flexibility. And you mentioned both. So thank you. Segue. In recent years, there has been more collaborative efforts across the board from various organizations. And I echo the exact same statement in the sense that we need to merge and recognize those pathways into homelessness and strengthen from a preventative from our organizations, which we both do, to those that the sad reality is we know that there's exiting to homelessness and see how we can work together. I've always kind of worked from, and whether it's mentors and colleagues in the past, is it takes a village. So why not recognize that and work from that collaborative effort to be able to ensure that we provide wraparound care. I believe in preventative measures that go above and beyond with youth. And I think youth are always uniquely a specific lens we have to look at, in the sense that they need warm transfers. They need to trust that Becky knows Danny and would never transition to someone that she didn't trust, type thing. And, it speaks to our 2 organizations too, working, like our organizations have had MOUs and partnership for a long time. And, we recognize where our age limits are within certain programs and so forth. But again, we would always ask for more flexibility and rustle feathers and do what we need to do where we do it. But then we create that continuum of care where Becky knows that any youth that she's serving, if they are to age out of what her mandate may be, our place Peel's here to continue the support and do warm transfer and understand that this youth doesn't, we may have resolved homelessness, but now we're going to provide aftercare to ensure that we prevent it from happening again, sort of thing, right? So we need to marry the different sectors and continue to. I think that there's been a lot of effort and strong collaborations created, and they've been successful. And so we need to continue down that path and recognize that together we're making more of a dent at this. To end youth homelessness is a grand task, but there is hope in the end, and I truly believe that we can. I've been a part of working groups that have functional zero within their communities, and really being able to keep those supports and services for when there is an emergency. It can definitely be offered, but we can continue to get ahead of it, and we see a little more each day, and that's really hopeful for us in the sector doing the work.
I think that's exactly what we need, which is, positivity, seeing that the supports are working and, that there is actually more to do. It's not an on and off switch of, you're not homeless anymore. It's over. There's much more, to be done to really get to that finish line, and it's a process. One of the part of the process, though, is family reunification. So it's been seen as a support to return youth to their families and stabilize their housing. Uh, for you both, what's your opinion on this? Is this a successful tool, or do you return to the streets? Like, what goes on here?
When a young person is out of their home, whether it's for a weekend or whether it's for 3 weeks, again, with family reunification, that work needs, for it to be effective, it needs to start like long before a young person leaves, and it needs to sustain and maintain even when that young person is out of the home. So I think we certainly try to embed, programs, and to kind of piggyback from our last question or answer is that low barrier, right? So low barrier in terms of access, so for families and for youth. And as Danny said before, warm transfers. Those are two things that again are key for family reunification, and sustainable planning. So again, not just okay, you've had your breaks, right? Family is like, okay, they can come back home now. Youth is saying, I guess I'll give it a shot. But from that trauma-informed lens, that being homeless or, underhoused for a young person is traumatic. It is also traumatic for their family. And so just recognizing that and those flexible, long-term, barrier-free supports, I think are key to, embed how to communicate with youth. That's a big piece for families. That communication starts breaking down when they're young, again, when they're starting to figure out who they are as a person. And then pair that with, barriers, intergenerational trauma, racism, discrimination. So certainly not a simple answer, but I think family reunification can be very successful. And of course, no one wants a young person to not reside with their family if that family can provide a safe and stable home. I just think the key is low barrier, warm handoff, and not just having a youth transition back home and having a referral in place for a family support. Really thinking about it from before it started.
I absolutely agree. For the work that we've seen and done in terms of family reconciliation, we also throw in the words natural supports as well, and really identifying from the youth whom they see as that supportive person in their life. So, return to home could look very differently. We've had youth successfully return to another family member where they're still receiving that long-term, flexible, supportive counseling and supports to eventually get back, or maybe stay with that other family member and continue to work on the relationships. We know that if we are able to have an identified family member or natural support for a youth that is exiting homelessness, they are, the likelihood of them sustaining that housing and being able to remain out of the homeless system increases tenfold, because they have someone that they can reach out to be able to work through. So we're also trying to identify those connections and ensure that they have someone supportive and reliable in their life to even just talk through like daily items where they don't know what to do. They're at the bank. This is what they're saying. How do I? Right. And although we can be those supports, we also want to establish independence in the youth and so forth. I think the other component to this with the family reunification is really having strong, culturally appropriate, culturally knowledgeable and aware staff that are able to do this work. Because when you look at the demographics of Peel and recognizing in who we serve, there is the need to come at it from a very open mind and be able to support families or identified supports where they're at. And there is a lot of stigma around mental health and understanding. We are working with families where the family themselves, are landed here, but then the youth themselves is first generation, growing up in a very different society and trying to work through that. And it's all coming from very good places and a big heart, but there's where worlds clash. So we have to be very knowledgeable and understanding and work at it from both ends to be able to have it successful. But preventative in nature, the earlier we can get those supports and services in place to truly understand. We always joke and say that youth just in general speak another language because they're youth, they're impulsive, they're all over the place. Moods are high, moods are low. It just kind of goes all over. I think any family member or friend sometimes needs help navigating how a peer feels from time to time, right? So it's really just recognizing where they're at on both ends and offering those supports, not just one, because you'll continue to see that breakdown if both ends aren't trying to understand one another.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like it's like a lot of one understanding experiences people have gone through it. It's patience. It's a lot of research. It's a whole lot of things. And I guess to wrap up and end this conversation is the most loaded question I'm going to ask you both. And you're all going to laugh because you're like, well, it's in your opinion, what would prevent youth homelessness? Like, what are the supports? What are the resources you would need to prevent youth homelessness, especially in Peel? And yeah, let me know what you think, what those two are or what those are.
So I think that there's strong family systems and education and awareness and resources. I think at the end of the day, we have to be able to be, podcasts like this to be able to get the word out that it does exist and there are options to help end it, right? And education awareness in that sense, as well as, it's not that it's, I'm not reinventing the wheel here. Meet youth where they're at. School, 9 times out of 10, they're at school all day. So if we can get early intervention programs into schools, and it does exist and there is some work being done, but really recognizing like additional key areas that Peel can continue to grow on is, doing the intervention and getting ahead of it where we have the youth present for, an entire day and so forth. And you start to see the numbers lessen, less youth falling out of school. And then from the housing end is really housing security and supports. I know bit of a statistic nerd when it comes to this, but I know if a youth is housed, they're more likely, I think 9 times out of 10, to stay with their education path versus if they're experiencing homelessness, I think it's like 1 out of 3 may be still enrolled in high school because of everything that they have going on and what they actually have to do. So when you look at that, if we can, the statistics are telling us, so let's use that data to like try some out of the box ways to see how we can work from a prevention lens to stop the inflow. I think that really can significantly support. And then the collaboration between sectors, the healthcare, the justice system, the child welfare system, and so forth, entry points that we know exist. And let's try to do diversion right from the start so that we don't have to just accept them to the shelter system, but put that diversion and the family and natural supports right off the bat. Who do you have? We call it refresh your network. Refresh for me who your network is, and then let's get it out there, right? Like let's put that spider web together and get your connections going and who we can have you stay with, even if it's for a couple weeks, and we'll support and keep that going.
Just being proactive, right? Being proactive rather than reactive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the cultural relevancy too that you mentioned earlier is so key. Just understanding the overrepresentation of the different communities and the intersectionalities. So yeah, very good point. I keep thinking about there's a document, I guess, or a roadmap that was created, and we'll do it much more justice than I can in this conversation. I think it's like the roadmap for youth homelessness prevention through the Homelessness Hub. And I think I know it well, and I think there's some really great opportunities embedded through that to, really focus on the prevention side, as we've mentioned lots of times, but, from a systems perspective, way back to, how do we support these families that perhaps have young children who are in our school system and they could be at risk. The family could be at risk too, right? So, looking at kind of the structural prevention, systems prevention, early intervention, I think looking at how we can engage landlords or opportunities for more safe and affordable housing. And like, as Danny said, those pathways and just, barrier-free supports. And then again, of course, I think we do a really, I'm biased, of course, but our partners at Our Place Peel do a really good job of being able to try their best to support as many youth as possible. So those kind of emergency imminent supports are, of course, key. And then thinking outside of the walls of those places, which again, OPP has done great at. They do have some other supports that go beyond just the shelter piece under those roofs. So I think that's important because you're meeting a youth where they're at, right? And then the long-term piece is, if it's family reunification, what does family mean to that young person? So is there someone in that circle of care or what have you? And then how do we break that cycle? So how do we break the cycle so that they don't end up, back in the shelter system? What do we need to wrap around that young person or that family to really prevent them having to come back? Because I think about those simple, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that simple like food, shelter, and so as Danny said, if the stats have spoken for themselves, if a young person, we want them to finish high school, we know that also leads to more employment opportunities and things like that. So, I think that the roadmap for the prevention of youth homelessness is probably something that has been worked on for years and really does pinpoint some of the stuff we've talked about today to hopefully, create some pathways across not just Peel, but, Ontario, Canada, to end youth homelessness. But it's a large, tricky, complex thing to navigate, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like preventing youth homelessness is just thinking about hope. And that clearly there is hope because there's the two unsung heroes I have right now that I'm talking to, Becky and Danny, who, clearly, what you do is affecting people, it's supporting people. But apart from me thanking you for being on the show, I want to thank you for all that you do. And I hope you're super proud of yourselves because this is not an easy thing to do, but it's also, I'm glad we're here talking to create awareness, have this conversation. And I hope that anybody that's listening can help contribute and help out more. So that wraps up this episode of Peel Talks Housing. I want to thank Danny and Becky for both being here for such an amazing conversation. You can find information about our podcast at peelregion.ca, and you can join the conversation on the Region of Peel's social media accounts. My name is Axel Villamil, and this is Peel Talks Housing. The opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individuals expressing them and may not reflect the opinions of the Region of Peel or the direction provided by the Region of Peel's Council.